Standing face to face in the Chancellor's office, Angela Merkel delivered an ultimatum that no Israeli prime minister had ever heard before. She gave Benjamin Netanyahu exactly 72 hours to make a choice that would determine not just his political future, but the fate of millions. What was that impossible choice, and which option did he pick when the clock ran out? But before I reveal what happened in those final moments, you need to understand how two of the world's most powerful leaders ended up in a confrontation that would reshape the entire Middle East. Because what you're about to discover will shock you more than any political scandal you've ever heard. It was 3:47 a.m. Berlin time when Netanyahu's encrypted phone buzzed. The message was brief, cold, and terrifying in its simplicity. Berlin, tomorrow, come alone. A.M. For the first time in his political career, the man who had stared down dictators and terrorists felt his hands tremble as he read those words. You see, Netanyahu thought he had Merkel figured out. For 16 years, he had played the game perfectly, using Germany's historical guilt, leveraging their economic interests, manipulating their fear of instability. He had turned Angela Merkel into his most valuable European asset, without her even realizing it. Or so he believed. But what Netanyahu didn't know was that 3 days earlier, Merkel had discovered something that would change everything between them forever. A piece of intelligence so damaging, so personally devastating, that it would force her to abandon 16 years of careful diplomatic balance and deliver the most brutal ultimatum in modern political history. The flight to Berlin was the longest 4 hours of Netanyahu's life. His security detail noticed something they had never seen before, their usually confident prime minister staring out the window in complete silence. His jaw clenched, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. What was going through his mind during those quiet moments above the clouds? He was remembering their first meeting in 2005. Young Angela Merkel, recently elected chancellor, sitting across from him with that characteristic hand gesture. Fingertips pressed together, forming what the media would later call the Merkel diamond. She had been so eager to rebuild German-Israeli relations, so desperate to prove that her Germany was different from the dark chapters of history. Netanyahu had seen opportunity where others saw sincerity. He had spent years cultivating their relationship, feeding her information that served his purposes, withholding truths that didn't. Every state dinner, every private meeting, every public appearance had been carefully orchestrated to maintain his influence over European policy. Merkel trusted him, and Netanyahu had weaponized that trust for his own political survival. But now, flying toward what could be his final confrontation, Netanyahu couldn't shake the feeling that somehow Merkel had discovered the truth about their relationship. The real question wasn't whether she knew, it was how much she knew and what she planned to do about it. The limousine ride from Tegel Airport to the Chancellery was eerily quiet. Usually Berlin's streets would be bustling with activity, but it was as if the entire city was holding its breath. Netanyahu's phone had been silent for hours, no calls from his advisors, no updates from his intelligence chiefs, no political emergencies requiring his immediate attention. The silence was more unsettling than any crisis he had ever faced. When he arrived at the Chancellery, something was different. The usual protocol was missing. No formal reception, no photography, no joint statements to the press. Just a single aide who escorted him through corridors he had walked dozens of times before, but which now felt foreign and threatening. The aide stopped at a door Netanyahu had never seen opened. "The Chancellor is waiting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As Netanyahu reached for the handle, he noticed his reflection in the polished brass, and for a split second, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. Inside, Merkel stood with her back to the door, gazing out at the Spree River. She didn't turn around when he entered. She didn't offer him a seat. She simply said, "Close the door, Benjamin. What we're about to discuss cannot leave this room." The formality in her voice sent chills down Netanyahu's spine. In 16 years of friendship, she had never called him Benjamin. It had always been Bibi, the nickname that made him feel like family. But now, that cold formality told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a meeting between allies, this was a trial, and he was the defendant. "Angela," he began, but she raised her hand to stop him. "No," she said, finally turning to face him. The woman who stood before him was not the Merkel he remembered. Gone was the warm smile, the patient demeanor, the diplomatic courtesy that had defined their relationship. In its place was something he had never seen before. Pure, undiluted disappointment, mixed with barely contained rage. For 16 years, she began, her voice steady but filled with an emotion that made Netanyahu's stomach drop. I have defended you. To my parliament, to my people, to my European colleagues who questioned your methods. I stood by you through every controversy, every scandal, every international incident. Do you know why? Netanyahu opened his mouth to respond, but Merkel continued before he could speak. Because I believed in you. I believed that despite your flaws, despite your political calculations, you genuinely cared about the security and future of your people. I believed that underneath all the political maneuvering, there was still a leader who put his nation's interests above his own. She paused, and in that silence, Netanyahu felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine fear. Not fear of political consequences or media criticism, but fear of losing something he hadn't realized he valued until this moment. Merkel's respect had become more important to him than he had ever admitted, even to himself. I was wrong, she said, and those two words hit Netanyahu like a physical blow. Merkel walked to her desk and picked up a manila folder. Netanyahu recognized it immediately, the classification markings, the security seals, the weight of secrets it contained. His mouth went dry as he realized which intelligence file she was holding. 3 days ago, Merkel said, opening the folder, I received a rather interesting report from our intelligence services. It seems they've been monitoring some unusual financial transactions. Transactions that involve offshore accounts, defense contracts, and a very familiar name. Netanyahu felt the walls of the room closing in around him. He knew exactly which transactions she was referring to, and he knew that if those details became public, it wouldn't just end his political career, it would destroy everything he had spent his life building. But that's not what disappointed me most. Merkel continued, her voice growing colder with each word. What broke my heart was discovering how you've been using our friendship. How every piece of intelligence I shared with you, every policy position I supported, every public statement I made in your defense. It was all part of your calculation, wasn't it? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Netanyahu opened his mouth to deny it, to offer explanations, to deploy the charm and deflection that had served him so well throughout his career. But looking into Merkel's eyes, he realized that every word he might say would only make things worse, because she was right. Every dinner conversation where she had confided her concerns about European security, he had used to advance his own agenda. Every private meeting where she had sought his counsel on Middle Eastern policy, he had manipulated to benefit his political standing back home. Every moment of genuine friendship she had offered, he had calculated for its strategic value. You used me, she said, and the hurt in her voice was more devastating than any accusation. You used my guilt about Germany's history, my genuine desire for peace, my personal affection for you, and you turned it all into weapons for your own political survival. Netanyahu finally found his voice. Angela, you don't understand the pressures I face, the threats to my country, the political opposition. Stop. Her voice cut through his explanation like a blade. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was about Israel's security. This was about Benjamin Netanyahu's survival. There's a difference. And we both know it. She was right, and they both knew it. For years, Netanyahu had conflated his own political fortunes with his country's security needs. He had convinced himself that his survival was essential to Israel's survival, that any means were justified by that end, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone whose opinion mattered to him made the self-deception impossible to maintain. Here's what's going to happen, Merkel said, closing the intelligence file and fixing him with a stare that could have frozen the Mediterranean. You have exactly 72 hours to make a choice. The most important choice of your life. Netanyahu felt his heart pounding as she continued. Option 1, you return to Israel, announce your immediate resignation from politics, cooperate fully with any investigations into your financial dealings, and disappear quietly into private life. If you choose this option, the intelligence file stays classified. Our friendship ends but remains private, and you get to preserve some small measure of dignity. The room spun around Netanyahu as the implications hit him. Resignation would mean the end of everything he had worked for, the destruction of his political legacy, the abandonment of his vision for Israel's future. It would also mean facing his enemies without the protection of office, confronting the legal consequences of decisions he had made in the shadows. Option 2, Merkel continued, her voice as steady as a judge reading a sentence. You refuse to resign, continue your political games, and try to weather this storm as you have so many others. If you choose this option, I will personally ensure that every detail in this file becomes public. Not just in Germany, not just in Europe, but globally. Your financial dealings, your manipulation of intelligence, your betrayal of allies, all of it will be front-page news within the week. Netanyahu's mind raced through the political calculations that had become second nature to him. Could he survive such revelations? Could he spin them as attacks by enemies of Israel? Could he rally his base by playing the victim of international conspiracies? But as he looked at Merkel's face, he realized that this wasn't a political problem that could be solved with the usual tactics. This was personal. And Angela Merkel wasn't just any opponent, she was someone who had the credibility, the international standing, and the moral authority to destroy him completely. There is no option 3, she said, as if reading his thoughts. There's no negotiation, no compromise, no face-saving middle ground. You have 72 hours to decide who you really are, a leader who can acknowledge his mistakes and step aside with dignity, or a politician so addicted to power that he'll destroy everything and everyone around him to keep it. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside the window, Berlin continued its daily routine, oblivious to the fact that in this one room, the fate of Middle Eastern politics was being decided by two people who had once called each other friends. Netanyahu's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Probably his chief of staff wondering about his schedule, or his security detail coordinating his departure. He ignored it. For the first time in decades, the immediate demands of political life seemed less important than the moment he was living in. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "After all these years, after everything we've been through together, why are you doing this now?" Merkel's expression softened slightly. And for a moment, Netanyahu glimpsed the woman who had been his friend before she became his judge. "Because someone has to," she said. "Your own people won't hold you accountable. They're either too loyal or too afraid. Your political opponents are too compromised by their own ambitions. The international community is too dependent on stability to risk confronting you. But I'm leaving office anyway. I have nothing left to lose and everything to gain by finally telling you the truth." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a sadness that cut deeper than any anger. "And because I cared about you, I genuinely believed that somewhere underneath all the political calculation and personal ambition, there was still the man I met 18 years ago. The one who seemed to carry the weight of history on his shoulders, who spoke about his children's future with tears in his eyes, who made me believe that peace was still possible." Netanyahu felt something crack inside his chest. It wasn't his political armor or his public persona. It was something deeper, something human, that he had buried so deeply he had forgotten it existed. "That man is still there," he said, surprised by the honesty in his own voice. "Then prove it," Merkel replied. 72 hours, Benjamin. Show me, show yourself, who you really are when everything else is stripped away." The meeting was over. There were no handshakes, no diplomatic pleasantries, no promises to stay in touch. Netanyahu walked out of that office knowing that he was leaving behind, not just a political relationship, but the last friendship that had meant something real to him. The flight back to Tel Aviv was a nightmare of racing thoughts and impossible calculations. Netanyahu's staff tried to brief him on urgent matters, but their voices seemed to come from another world. All he could think about was the choice Merkel had given him and the countdown that had already begun. 72 hours. 3 days to decide between political death and personal destruction. 3 days to choose between preserving his legacy and preserving his soul. When he arrived home, Netanyahu did something he hadn't done in years. He turned off his phones, dismissed his security detail, and sat alone in his study. For the first time since he could remember, Benjamin Netanyahu was completely alone with his thoughts. He thought about his children, and what kind of man he wanted them to remember him as. He thought about his country, and whether his continued leadership was really serving its interests or just his own. He thought about Angela Merkel, standing in her office with that intelligence file, choosing to risk everything to give him one last chance at redemption. Most of all, he thought about the man he used to be, the young soldier who had genuinely believed in something larger than himself, who had entered politics to serve rather than to be served, who had once looked in the mirror and liked what he saw. The first day passed in a blur of avoided phone calls and canceled meetings. His staff grew increasingly frantic, his political allies demanded explanations, his enemies sensed weakness and began circling. But Netanyahu remained in isolation, wrestling with a decision that no amount of political experience had prepared him for. On the second day, he found himself reading letters from ordinary Israelis, people who had written to thank him for his service, to share their hopes and fears, to express their trust in his leadership. Some of the letters were from parents whose children served in the military, trusting him to make decisions that would keep them safe. Others were from elderly Holocaust survivors, who saw him as a guardian of their security. As he read their words, Netanyahu realized that at some point, he had stopped seeing these people as individuals with hopes and dreams and had started seeing them as political assets to be managed. Their trust had become his tool rather than his responsibility. On the third day, with less than 12 hours remaining in Merkel's ultimatum, Netanyahu's wife found him sitting in their garden, staring at the sunrise. She had seen him through countless political crises, but never like this. "What's happening, Bibi?" she asked, using the nickname that had once made him feel human. For the first time in their marriage, Netanyahu told her everything. About the intelligence file, about Merkel's ultimatum, about the choice that would determine not just his future, but the future of their entire family. He expected her to urge him to fight, to find a way to survive as he always had. Instead, she sat quietly for a long moment, then asked a question that shattered his remaining defenses. "When did you stop being the man I married?" The question echoed in Netanyahu's mind as the final hours ticked away. He thought about all the compromises he had made, all the principles he had abandoned, all the relationships he had sacrificed on the altar of political survival. He thought about the young man who had entered politics to make a difference, and the older man who had stayed in politics simply to avoid leaving. As the sun set on the third day, Netanyahu picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. When Merkel's voice answered, he could hear the resignation in her tone. She was expecting him to choose power over principle, as he had so many times before. "Angela," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I've made my decision." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like hours. "I'm calling a press conference tomorrow morning," he continued. "I'll announce my resignation from politics, effective immediately. I'll cooperate with any investigations, and I'll do something I should have done years ago. I'll tell the truth." The pause that followed was pregnant with the weight of history being made. "Are you sure?" Merkel asked, and Netanyahu could hear something in her voice that he hadn't heard in years: respect. "For the first time in a very long time," Netanyahu replied, "I'm completely sure." The next morning, standing before a room full of stunned reporters and political observers, Benjamin Netanyahu delivered the most important speech of his life. Not as a prime minister defending his policies, not as a politician spinning his legacy, but as a man acknowledging his failures and choosing dignity over destruction. "I have served Israel for most of my adult life," he said, his voice carrying a gravitas that surprised even his harshest critics. "But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why I entered public service in the first place. I began serving my own interests instead of Israel's interests. I chose political survival over moral leadership, and in doing so, I betrayed not just my country, but myself." The room was so quiet that the clicking of camera shutters sounded like thunder. Netanyahu continued, his words carrying the weight of a man who had finally found his way back to who he used to be. "Today, I am announcing my immediate resignation from politics. I am stepping down not just as prime minister but from public life entirely. Israel deserves better than a leader who has forgotten that power is a responsibility, not a right." As he spoke those words, Netanyahu felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: peace. Not the false peace of political victory or the temporary relief of surviving another scandal, but the deep, genuine peace that comes from finally telling the truth. Angela Merkel, watching the speech from her office in Berlin, allowed herself a small smile. The intelligence file that had started it all remained classified, as promised. The man she had once considered a friend had chosen redemption over revenge, dignity over destruction. In the end, the ultimatum that was meant to destroy Benjamin Netanyahu had instead saved him. Not his political career, not his public legacy, but something far more valuable. The choice between political death and personal destruction had revealed a third option that neither he nor Merkel had anticipated: the possibility of resurrection through truth. The boy who had once dreamed of serving his country had finally found his way home.